Hi, Graham.
Hello, Arnold.
Great to see you here. Uh, Today, my guest
Here.
is Graham Wren. He's a retired senior lecturer in OR at Lancaster University in the UK. He has been council member and conference chairman of the British OR Society and was editor of the prestigious Journal of the Operational Research Society for 6 years. Since 2014, he has edited the British Society's magazine called Impact. For IFORS, he was vice president and has been editor of both International Abstracts in Operations Research and International Transactions in Operational Research, as well as conference chairman. He was a founder member of both the International Society of Inventory Research and the Operations Management Association. Graham was also president of the Omega Rho Society. The OR Society made him a companion of operational research in 2006, and he was made a fellow by IFORS in 2021. Grant, thank you so much for being here. It's such a great honor. How are you?
I'm not sure there's anything else to say now after that introduction, but thank you.
I know you worked in Lancaster for so many years, but where are you actually from?
I was born in Birmingham in the centre of England. Yeah. Lancaster's in the north of England. So.
Oh, but your parents are also from Birmingham?
No, my father was. My mother was from the north of England, from the other side of the north of England, near Newcastle. And they met during the war in the early 1940s. And I arrived soon after the end of the war, after they had got married.
Right. You were born in 1947, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so you grew up during the 50s and early 60s. Were you involved in any type of activity other than going to school?
Well, yes. I was very involved with church, and I was taken to church by my parents and got very involved. And as I grew up, I got even more involved. I was also very keen on sport, and I played cricket, which many people won't know anything about. But I played for my school, and one of my proud achievements is that there is what they call the Cricketer's Bible, called Wisdom, and my school's cricket averages were published every year. So I'm mentioned twice in Wisdom, and I have a whole collection of these Wisdoms. They come out every year. So that's something I achieved only because I went to the right school.
That's actually very impressive. You still kept on playing cricket over the years?
Yes, yeah. I played until I was 65. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
I kept working my way down the team so that I was still making a contribution.
Yeah. In what position did you play?
Most recently, I was a bowler, so I tended to bat further down the order. Again, terms that many people won't understand. But when I started out, I was a batsman. But the batting side gradually dwindled and the bowling side increased. Yeah,
Yeah, it makes sense. The cricket is a very obscure sport here in Brazil. I'm familiar with most of the rules because my parents are from India, and I got to know more about the sport when I visited the country once. But this sport evolved over the years, from test matches to one-day internationals, 2020, and so on. What is your impression regarding these changes?
Well, I think I'm a fairly traditional person in all sorts of ways, but my preference again, and what I remember, would be the test matches, which last 5 days. People just don't understand, 30 hours, and could end up with no results. I mean, this is it's very strange. But I still follow everything, and in fact, as we speak, England are playing a match that they need to. They need to do reasonably well in order to get to the semi-finals of the 20-over game in the World Cup. So you're distracting me from that, but I'll forgive you for
sorry.
that.
Right.
And England are also playing rugby, and I've followed rugby very closely. I haven't played since I left school, but England are playing a rugby international at the moment as well.
So you played rugby in your school years?
At school I did, yes, but then everybody did. Well, not everybody.
Yeah, very brave.
Yes, I tended to find a position where I was outside of danger.
All right. What university did you attend, and what degree did you pick?
Yes, I went to Liverpool University. You might want to talk about Liverpool in the 60s for other reasons, but I went to Liverpool then, and I chose a maths degree to start with, but I ended up with a degree in computational and statistical science. So this is the undergraduate degree, as we call it in the UK. But the reason I chose the particular course I went on was that I'd been talking to a family friend. We went to their house for tea. He was the manager of the Operation Research Department at Cadbury's. Cadbury is very important confectionery manufacturer in the UK, and not very far from my home. They used to say that but quite often when I was playing cricket, I could smell the chocolate coming at my school. You could smell the chocolate from the factory, which was a couple of miles away. But he talked to me about his work, which quite a lot of it was statistical work, but not solely statistical, operational research work as well. And they were very interested in vehicle routing, as I discovered. So this interested me. I was supposed to be good at maths, and so that's why I applied for this particular degree. And in fact, in my final year, there was some modules on operational research, the mathematics of operational research.
Right. As you said, when talking about the 1960s and Liverpool, it's impossible not to think of the Beatles. Did you have the chance to see them?
No, I didn't. I met my wife at Liverpool, which is probably the most important thing that happened. And she had been to the Cavern, but even before the Beatles did, I think, or about the time the Beatles did. So we were aware of it. I didn't get involved. I didn't go to gigs or whatever they're called. But I remember them playing the film Help in the introductory week at the university, I think. But yes, I go back to Liverpool a lot now. It's 50 miles from where I live, and thoroughly enjoy it. But yes, Beatles have been very important to Liverpool.
You lived near Penny Lane, is that right?
I did, yes. The first 2 years I was at Liverpool, I was in University Hall's residence, and at the end of Penny Lane, and in fact then when the song Penny Lane came out, and the road sign disappeared overnight. So I lived at the other end of the road from the bus stop in the middle of the roundabout. And I never went to the barber shop there. But
there's the line behind the shelter in the middle of a roundabout in the song.
That was all there. The song, what they wrote about in the song was
fantastic.
Was there, and I walked along Penny Lane very regularly.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what was your first impression of OR during your undergrad?
Yes, well, it was, I said it was to do with the mathematics of operational research, which is understandable. So now I think operational research is much more than simply the mathematics. It's understanding what the problems are of the decision maker, and understanding data and interpreting data correctly and so on. So it was, the linear programming was just a straightforward linear programming, simplex method in those days, and simulation they taught as well. Queuing theory, I think I seem to remember, but it's a long time ago. I may be making all this up. But it was simply a branch of applied mathematics, I suppose. But I enjoyed it. I mean, yes, and I spent my last summer vacation working for Cadbury in the Cadbury OR department. So I had some real operation research, and ate a lot of chocolate. But then went back to university, finished my degree, and went back to work. While in my final year, I applied for a job, and they interviewed me, although they thought it was a bit pointless because they'd seen me for 8 weeks like the previous summer. But so I went through the full interview process, and they offered me a job, and got involved with real operation research at Cadbury. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you went back to Birmingham after earning your degree, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
so I went back. I went back home. The woman who's now my wife, she came down and got a job. She was a teacher.
Okay.
And we got married in my first year of work at Cadbury.
Uh-huh. And what was your job title? And I think there's something related to how it was presented when you got married. Yeah.
Well, I think the title was Operation Research Scientist. But when the local paper where we got married in my wife's hometown, when it published the photograph, the operational had got missed out. So I was the research scientist, which I think my wife was rather amused at because she'd actually done science degrees, she'd done chemistry degrees and taught chemistry. But I was the scientist.
But by the way, what do you think of the name Operations Research, or Operational Research?
Yes, well, it's at first, of course, that was the name. I didn't really think much about it, but in my involvement with societies, particularly the British Operation Research Society, we've debated more than once, what the name should be and should we change the name. And we've taken surveys of members, and I think the usual result is that most members think a different name would be better, but nobody can agree what it should be. So we stay with operational research. And of course, in recent years, there's been a lot of competition, as it were, from the name analytics. Mm-hmm. But still, we're the Operational Research Society, and IFORS it's IFORS. They get away with it. I know the acronym includes OR, Operations Research, of course. Mm-hmm. But yes, we still stick with the name that nobody understands.
Yeah, but this has been discussed in the British War Society and IFORS and so on.
Yeah. But my mother, I remember, was very pleased when I got my job at Cadbury's, and people would ask her, what job has he got? And she would say, Operation Research Scientist. Of course, the next question was, what is operational research? And I think that rather caused my mother a lot of consternation trying to explain what operational research was, and we still have a lot of difficulty explaining what it is. I think the best definition is what operational research is, what operational research people do. But
also there's
that doesn't help.
Yeah, we all go through that. From the field, and also some other names can be a bit confusing, like linear programming and
sure.
Because they think it's a language.
Nobody understands that. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I presume operational researchers do understand it, but the general public don't.
Yeah. What type of problems did you have to solve in the company?
Yes, they were very involved with vehicle routing. They had a lot of warehouses, depots, as we call them, and they would make deliveries to retail shops. In those days, there were many, many more retail shops. There were beginning to have extensive supermarket chains, but there were a lot of what we call corner shops, little shops. And so there were many deliveries on a route. And of course, vehicle routing, if they could make those more efficient, that would be very important. And they'd put people who were working there had already published papers. They'd given talks at Operation Research Society conferences and published papers about vehicle routing. And I got involved with that. And I remember after I'd left Cadbury's that I was travelling down a motorway with my family, and I saw a Cadbury delivery van. And if it was there on a particular day, that was because of me. And I could tell them that vehicle going up the motorway is going up because of work I had done. So that was very satisfying. And the other area was planning production, so going into factories, how to schedule the production and so on. So that was interesting. And I remember one of the interesting projects I did was at the Schweppes factory, where they were bottling soft drinks, squashes, of all sorts of different flavors through the same machine. And the flavors ranged from lemon to orange to included peppermint. And obviously then you had to clean them out to make sure that when you put the next flavor in, you couldn't taste particularly the peppermint, but certainly the other flavors. And that was a traveling salesman problem of a sort. But we worked out an optimal pattern, because some flavors would be made much more frequently, they're much more popular. So it wasn't simply, here's the schedule, just repeat this all the time. There would be a number of different schedules, and the peppermint, for instance, which was a very particular taste, would only be made every few cycles. But that was an interesting problem. And just seeing the equipment working, I mean, I've always been fascinated by how the engineers can convert a problem like how do you fill the bottles, for instance, into a machinery which then does it very effectively.
Yeah, we were talking about the late 60s and early 70s here.
The early 70s there, yes.
I'm very curious to know, how did you solve those problems back then?
Oh, well, there were what were called mainframe computers. So these were massive sets of cabinets in air-conditioned rooms. At Cadbury's, we would prepare them on punch cards. This is all ancient history to most people. And you would then get a set of punch cards, which would be your program, and send it to the computer department overnight. So then you came in the next morning and got the results. So it's, and I remember once that I was doing a regression analysis, and the results came back the next day after I set it up the previous day, and it was 100% successful. And I was a bit puzzled by this, but then I had made a mistake. I'd manipulated the equation, and essentially I got an equation that was y was equal to y, which not surprisingly was 100% effective. So yes, I mean, in a sense, looking back now to those days, it's very difficult to understand that you've lived through that sort of revolution in computing.
Yeah, it's 50 years ago, and I can only imagine how you had to really cope with all these challenges regarding the limitation with computers and so on.
Well, we did, but of course we didn't know any better in those days. We would find it very frustrating now if we had to go back to that.
Yeah, but that's certainly very impressive. So you left the company in 1973.
That's right, yes. Cadbury's sent me on some training courses that were delivered by people who became my colleagues. So I think they were optimization courses, simulation courses, and so on. So and one of these, I was talking to one of the teachers and said, I'd enjoyed my last year at university, particularly the interaction with the staff, and I had thought about going to university. And a few months later, he rang up and said, had I seen the advert? And I said, no, my wife's in hospital about to give birth to our first son. I didn't know it was going to be a son, but our first child. And I hadn't seen any advert. Anyway, I obviously then followed it up, and I applied and got the job. But of course, people would be very surprised now that somebody, firstly, I hadn't done any postgraduate degree, that I wouldn't be able to get the job like that now. I'd worked for three and a half years, and it was regarded, because Lancaster's OR department was a very practically oriented department. Everybody had at some point worked for real in operation research in an organisation. They regarded that as equivalent, but no longer the case. So anyway, I joined and the Lancaster department in 1973. Yeah, and I was there for 43 years.
Wow, it's a long time.
It was a great opportunity for me because the OR department was the first OR department in the UK. It was set up in 1964 when the university was founded. It was one of the founding departments of the university. So it was a very prestigious place to be in the OR world. And indeed, the university's done very well, not particularly thanks to me, but it's highly ranked now. But so I was very fortunate. I was with people that had got good reputations, well-known people in the OR world. And
yeah, absolutely.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah. You just mentioned that you don't have a PhD degree.
No.
How far that affected your professional life?
Well, it did occasionally because other universities would require that if they were asking me for instance, to be a visiting lecturer or something. But I supervised PhD students. I was an external examiner for PhD students. So in many ways, it didn't really affect me. But yes.
Yeah, but it's unusual, right?
Yes, not in those days, I don't think. But yes, things began to change very quickly after that.
Okay.
So, yes, it's only the old folks like me that would think it was a normal sort of thing. You know. Of course, in the early days of OR departments, there weren't PhDs in OR, so the first staff clearly weren't necessarily have PhDs. Some of them did them on the job, but yes, now of course the route is to go to university, get an undergraduate degree, get a postgraduate degree, get a PhD, and then join academic life. Yeah.
I met Professor Richard Iglesias once, and he was very kind to me. Was you already there when you joined?
Yes, my recollection is that I taught him. He was doing a master's degree about the time I joined.
So you taught him, actually?
I think I did. Of course, it's a long time ago now. My recollection is that I did, but I knew him as a student, and he went into teaching, and then went to work in an OR department, and then came back to the university, and yes, had a very glittering academic career. I was in his shadow. We did a lot of work together over the years, and we're very good friends.
Oh, excellent. And in your CV, you mentioned that you supervise a lot of master's work related to companies.
Yes, that's the MSc program, not only in Lancaster, but typically in British universities, was a 1-year, 12-month program. The last 4 months of which would be a project done for a client. In those days, it's not necessarily the case now. A lot more often, perhaps than not, they're research-based projects. But in those days, we would do consultancy work for clients, and usually with a couple of students and a member of staff would be a typical arrangement. So yes, I did work for companies all over the UK, from the south coast to north into Scotland. It was very interesting. Of course, you got around, you met a lot of people, you met real problems and tried to help the companies.
Were they aware of OR in those days? The company?
They obviously, we'd explain to them what it was that we could do. So as much as they managed to grasp that, they understood. But yes, they wouldn't be familiar with what operational research was, or the tools, the techniques we could bring to bear on their issues.
Yeah, you joined IFORS in 1974.
Well, yes, I mean, technically, individuals don't join IFORS. It's a federation of operational research societies, but I got involved with IFORS very quickly after coming to Lancaster, in that one of my colleagues was the chairman of the Operational Research Society's Publications Committee, and they were looking to replace the contributing editor, as they were called, to International Abstracts in OR, which was an IFORS publication. And the previous editor had said he wanted to stop. So I was asked if I would do it, and I said yes. And the job entailed looking at the publications, the British Journal of Operational Research, but also other journals published in the UK, and extracting an abstract, classifying it, and then sending it to the overall editor, who would then put it into the monthly, they weren't monthly, every 2 months probably, issues of International Abstracts. So it was a book of abstracts, which then readers could look at and see what was being published. And the classification process was the key thing, because you would enable people to find it. So it was, in a sense, a precursor to Google Scholar or whatever, but obviously that wasn't in existence at the time. And I was involved with that for many, many years. In one way or the other, I moved on from being the UK contributing editor to being the overall editor. And then when I passed that on, I was still involved. And then I was chairman of the IFORS Publication Committee, so I was still involved. So for 40 years, probably, I was involved in that. Or more, in fact.
Yeah, you have a long history with IFORS.
Yeah.
And tell me about the early years and the early days of IFORS, and how did everything start?
Yes, the IFORS started, I suppose it claim it started in the UK. There was an international conference that was held in Oxford in 1957. I have they published proceedings. I don't know how visible this is, but this is the proceedings of the first international conference. Wow. And one of the interesting things of this particular volume is that it has a photograph of all the people that were there, and all the great and the good at that time were there. Philip Morse, George Danzig, lots of obviously British people.
Fantastic.
And David Hertz. There's a list of them all, so they can be identified. Russ Aikoff, Wes Churchman were all there. So that was held in Oxford in 1957. And during that conference, they realised they didn't want it to be the last one, and they wanted to set up some form of cooperation between the different societies. The sponsors of that conference were the Operation Research Society of America, the Operation Research Society in the UK, and the French Operation Research Society. So the three societies had come together and produced this conference. So they went out one evening. So the key people went out one evening and had a discussion about what should happen next, and it was agreed that they should form an international federation. And so then some people were charged with actually drawing up the rules, how this federation would work. One of them was from the UK, who had been very involved in that first conference, called Pat Rivett, who in fact founded the Operation Research Department in Lancaster. He was the first professor of OR in the UK. Mm-hmm. And I remember talking to him many times. He was very proud that because they were going to have societies as members, and the societies would be different sizes, and clearly going to be dominated by the US society, but there were some societies which had very few members. When it came to voting, it was not, should it be one vote per society? That didn't seem to be fair for the bigger societies. Mm-hmm. But equally, giving undue weight to the bigger societies might also be seen to be unfair. So he introduced the square root. So the voting power for each society is the square root of the number of members that they had, paid up members. And he was very proud with it. It's still the case that when they tally the votes for any election or any change in the rules, that's how it's determined.
Very interesting. So it's still
using the square root. So it's, yes, I don't think there are many societies that have square roots in there. in their arrangements.
Yeah. Attending conferences during the 70s should have been a very interesting experience. How was it in your case?
Yes, I didn't go to many in the 70s. I went to one or two of the British conferences. The first overseas conference I went to was the second European conference. So within IFORS, various regional groupings were created, and the first one was Europe. That was created in early 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and their second conference, I think, was in 1976, and it was in Stockholm.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to that, so that was my first experience of going to an international conference. My second, I think, was to go to the IFORS conference, which is held every 3 years, in 1981, and that was in Hamburg. I'd been to an Informs conference. Well, it was also Tim's in those days.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a conference in Milwaukee in 1980.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the starting point. I've been to many conferences, but in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I would go to probably three international conferences every year. So
Yeah.
I got around the world on the strength of being involved and doing work for these conferences.
Right. It seems that in Stockholm you are short of budget.
Yes, I've always been very conscious of expenses and been very parsimonious with not spending money. And I knew that it was going to be very expensive in Sweden, the meals, but also the drink. So it seems very strange now, but when I went, I took my lunches with me. And these consisted of a packet of biscuits, some cheese that you could squeeze out of a tube, and a drink of lime juice. And so I had a bottle of lime juice and these things in my bag when I got to Heathrow Airport. So because of when I got to the airport with my lunch for 3 or 4 days, the person checking my bags, the lady checking my bags at the airport, queried what the green liquid was. And I explained, and she thought it was a very good idea and very sensible. But going out in the evenings for dinner with the Germans or whoever, it was just embarrassing that I couldn't really believe the prices of the meals. And so I found it all very difficult. I think it's my attitude to money. I'm very I don't like spending other people's money, and I don't like spending my own money either.
Okay, do you have any interesting stories from the IFORS conferences that took place in the 80s?
How long have you got? So I think I mentioned that the first one I went to was in Hamburg in 1981, and we combined that with a family holiday. We went into Denmark and then drove down to Hamburg. And I remember that the first thing was a reception I went to the first evening we had 2 small children, 2 boys. And I remember that they broke a glass. And were immediately, there was a group of, I think they were mainly American ladies who came and very solicitous, and they said, "Oh, don't worry about this, we'll sort it all out." And my recollection is that one of them was Hugh Miser's wife. Now, Hugh Miser was a very significant player in American OR, indeed world OR, and his wife Jodie. We became very good friends, and I don't know whether it was simply a result of that, but that was the first contact I'd had with him. And we exchanged Christmas cards and continued to do so after Hugh had died, until Jodie died. But yes, it wasn't the best start to my IFORS career in that sense at the conferences, but we enjoyed that. If I could continue talking about Hugh, I've got a Thai story that you haven't heard about, but I've been very keen on ties. Now, the British Society has ties, which is like this.
Oh, really?
So this was the first one that the British Society had. What you can see is the OR symbol.
Right.
But it's not simply, it's OR constructed in a particular way. It's actually, if you look at it like this, it's a steel being rolled in a rolling mill.
Oh, yeah.
So the two cylinders are rolling the steel. So because steel was so important in the start of Operation Research, they created this tie. Well, not many people would wear a tie like that. And indeed, occasionally I produce this at an OR conference and people wonder what it was like. But then a second one was produced, which had a single. So that's slightly more acceptable. It's just a bit more discreet. But over the years, I've collected various ties. I received one from the Japanese, and this is very discreet. There is an OR just there.
Oh, yeah.
But this was the Japanese OR Society gave me this one. And then Euro, the European Federation, they produced a tie. This was supposed to be best Danish design. I'm not so sure about that, but that was the Euro tie. But Informs never had a tie, and IFORS has never had a tie. But Hugh Miser came to the north of England for a conference once, and we thought we ought to give him a gift. And we gave him an OR Society tie. And sometime later, he mentioned to me he only ever wore bow ties.
Oh.
So having a tie like that, a necktie, was quite inappropriate, really. He was very gracious about it, but it wasn't the best gift I've ever given.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and over the 80s, there was some diplomatic incidents.
Yes, well, so I said the first conference I went to was 1981. The second conference was in 1984. They were held every 3 years. Was due to be held in Argentina, but there was a conflict which some people will remember between the United Kingdom and Argentina.
Yeah, of course.
At that time, which resulted in the conference being moved from Argentina to America. It was held in Washington in 1984, but went back to Argentina in 1987. And I was asked to be. I was quite involved. I was asked to be the editor of the proceedings. So that was the first conference, which I showed you earlier. And the proceedings by then had got. So that was what I edited.
Wow, it's a thick book.
1987, yes, and it was a lot of hard work. But because I was involved with the organising, the programme committee, really, I was involved with to do that. There were at least two particular diplomatic incidents that occurred while we were in Argentina. One was purely concerned the British. We had a reception one evening, and there was a parade of flags which included the flags of all the countries that were represented at the conference except the flag of the United Kingdom. And of course that caused some consternation with my fellow participants from the UK. But that had happened, nothing could be done about it. There was apologies were made by the OR people in Argentina, but they weren't in control of that. But the more that was interesting. But the one that occupied even more time was the delegation from the People's Republic of China were very concerned about how we were describing those that came from Taiwan, and they were threatening to leave the conference because, in their view, that we were treating Taiwan as a separate country. And it took a lot of several hours of negotiation with them to persuade them to stay. But the chair of the program committee at the end wondered if I'd ever thought of having a career in the diplomatic service. But anyway, I don't think a lot of my friends would think that I was suitable for the diplomatic service, but that was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then, as a result of that conference, I was asked. I'm jumping ahead of the questions you're going to ask, but I was asked to be the chair of the program committee in the conference in 1990.
That was exactly my next.
Yeah, I could see that in your eyes. Yeah. I'm quite surprised me that they would ask me, but I thoroughly enjoyed that. So that was in Athens in 1990, and
I wonder how you organized the conference program.
Yeah, well, now I wonder how I did it. Yes, the process now for organising a conference is that there are various computer programs that will do this, and Informs have got one, and IFORS use the Informs one. I think Euro have got similar sort of thing, and they produce the abstract booklet. I wasn't even using email in those days, and I did the whole schedule on my desk in my office using cards, and I would shuffle them around to get sensible sessions with related topics and so on.
Uh-huh.
The speakers would have sent the abstracts of their papers, which I then gave to a secretary, and when I'd got the schedule organised, they produced camera-ready copy, which was then shipped to Athens to produce the programme booklet. All very different these days. You look back on things like that and you wonder how you did it. And then you hear people who are asked to get involved in these sorts of things, and they're very concerned about what support they will get, what programs will be used, who will do all the input and so on. And I remember back then, they were smaller conferences, of course, but doing it all myself, yeah.
Yeah, I asked this because I recently worked on the conference scheduling problem, and I noticed that one of the first references on this topic is a paper by Professor Iglesias and you that appeared, I think, in JORS around 1987.
Yeah.
So
yes, I went to a Christian conference, and they were organising some seminars, and they simply asked people which seminars they wanted to go to, and hadn't thought about how then they would construct a timetable. And my brother was very involved with the organisation that was organising the conference, hosting the conference. And so I said, we could probably do something to help, because I could see that they were going to disappoint a lot of people. They wouldn't be able to work out how to schedule all the seminars. So Richard, who was also very involved with Christian activities, he worked with me. He did all the hard work, but I provided the data, I think. But yes, so we wrote it up, yes. And now it's interesting after all these years that people still see that. And,
it's a seminal paper and very, very important reference. We published a couple of papers on this topic, the one in particular in JORS, where we tell the story of how we did the conference schedule of the Brazilian OR conference.
Right. So I'm still getting cited, am I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Oh goodness. Fame at last.
Yeah, you joined the British OR Society in 1970. And about 20 years later, you became the editor-in-chief of the famous Journal of the Operation Research Society.
Yes.
Did you make more friends or enemies while occupying that position?
Well, contrary to perhaps the expectation of an operation research scientist, I'd never counted how many friends I made or how many enemies I made, so I don't know the answer to the question. In terms of friends that I made, I remember at a conference in the States, somebody saying that they had tried at several places to publish one of their papers, which was the start of a field in recycling and that sort of work in inventory control. And I'd been prepared to publish it, and they were very grateful. They had become very prestigious in that particular area. So I did make some friends. I'm sure I made enemies. I hope I didn't make enemies. I'd been an author. I'd been rejected. I mean, that is part of the course, really, isn't it? I could always hide behind the referees. Occasionally we'd reject papers out of hand because they just weren't so suitable for the journal, of course. But yes, the people would be disappointed, and some of them expressed their disappointment, and we tried to find a way around it. But yes, that's what happens.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that JORS changed publishers several times in recent years. Do you know why?
Yes. Well, yes, I do, because I was very involved in this, being on the publications committee of the society. So the very significant change was when we moved from publishing. We were published by Pergamon Press, which was owned by someone called Maxwell, who was notorious, and he didn't give us enough money, is basically the situation. And we realized, because of other deals that other journals were getting with publishers, that we would be able to get significantly more. And so we did when we moved to Macmillan. I was involved in the discussions about that, but the interesting thing I remember now was that we were told that they would ensure that none of our addresses was public knowledge to Maxwell and his cohorts, because they were quite fearful of what would happen, because it was a big deal for them. So that was an interesting experience. And then we moved again from, the question of the amount of money that would come to the society. It was the same situation most recently, about I suppose 5 or 6 years ago, when we had a bidding process, and the various publishers bid for this, and I was on the part of the selection panel, and we moved to Taylor and Francis at that particular point from Macmillan at that point. Yeah.
Right.
So some interesting discussions, but I mean it is they are very crucial financial assets for societies, and indeed certainly for the British Society.
Do you have any reflections to share about your British Oral Society after being a member for more than 50 years?
Yes. Well, I remember when I was very young and I looked up to everybody else, and of course was meeting with all the great and the good people in OR in the UK, and certainly in other countries. We had visitors from other countries as well when at the conferences, for instance. And now I'm old and grey, and I don't suppose people look up to me, but it's I go to conferences now, and it's full of younger people, and it's quite interesting for the roles to have been reversed. But yeah, when I started, it was very, very much a practitioner based. I mean, there were so few academics. There had only been OR departments for 6 years when I joined. So most people were members of operation research groups in various organisations. And fortunately, the British Society, there is still a good balance. I don't know precisely, but I suspect it's probably 50-50 in terms of practitioners and academics. And so there is still a very important aspect is actually meeting the needs of the practitioners and supporting them, giving training, but also the emphasis of practical operational research work, not simply more esoteric mathematics. And I'm very pleased that that's still the case, but obviously there's been a shift in that towards the research side of things. I'm going to say pure research. It's not pure research, as a mathematician would call it, but that shift is taking place. But it's not as much as in other societies. So, for instance, the European Society is. There is an attempt to involve the practitioners, but it's very much dominated by academics.
Yeah, in Brazil as well. Brazilian Society is dominated by academics. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but is it reasonable to suggest that OR never really attracted the interest of computer scientists in the UK?
Yeah, that's probably a reasonable position to take. Yes, I mean, obviously there would have been exceptions to that. Interesting enough, that we talked about that first conference at Oxford. One of the people there was called Berners-Lee, and he was the father of Tim Berners-Lee. He was in operational research, the founder of the internet.
Oh.
So his father was at the very first international conference, and he worked for ANTI, and I think it was for ANTI at the time, in the computer company, but took the operation research label and was prepared to go to an operation research conference. Mm-hmm. But obviously his major contribution was to have a son who then invented the World Wide Web. But yes, I think in general terms that's the case. So that now there's obviously big debates about where does OR and data science fit together, for instance, and obviously computing scientists have got very much involved with data science. Operation researchers think that data science should be in their field, so there's a bit of a clash, a very real clash at Lancaster University, because they produced an MSc, a postgraduate program in data science, a few years ago without any consultation with the operation research department, and we were furious about that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right.
We're on reasonably good terms with them now. We share a lot of seminars and things. So.
Mm-hmm. You became vice president of IFORS in the late 90s.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Was it more or less at that time that you tried to help developing OR in Africa?
Yes, it would be about then. Yes, it was an interesting progression. Obviously, I've been very involved with IFORS in a number of different ways, and I was asked to be vice president. The process for vice presidents is that there is one from each of the regional groupings, and then there's one from outside of that, the vice president at large. So that was the role that I had. But yes, IFORS and indeed Europe were very concerned with developing OR in developing countries in general, but particularly in Africa. There's an OR society in South Africa, has been for many, many years. And when the regional groupings were created in IFORS, South Africa was put into Europe. Well, obviously that's worked very well. But you'd think you'd like the continent of Africa to have a regional grouping of societies. So I got quite involved in trying to encourage the development of operation research, particularly in East Africa. I went to a number of conferences, and I've got a hat here from one of the conferences. This was in to keep the sun out. There was sun in those days. I sometimes wear it here. This was the conference in Tanzania in 2004.
Wow! So
I'd been to Tanzania then. I'd already been to Kenya. I'd done some work in the 80s at a sugar estate in Kenya. So I suppose that's really what whetted my appetite. I'd come from the UK. I was doing some OR work at a sugar estate. Why weren't the people in Kenya doing that sort of work? We had several Kenyan PhDs come to Lancaster, for instance, and to get their PhDs. So I went to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Uganda, to the conferences, and they had a grouping called OSEA, OR Society of East Africa, and we were trying to encourage them to get involved with IFORS. They never have done, which is quite disappointing, really. But so we made some attempts, and there is a group called AFROS, African Federation of OR Societies, that's recently been created, and people in Nigeria and North Africa, as well as obviously the South Africans and other countries, trying to create this grouping so that they can support each other. I mean, clearly in continents like Africa, there are many problems that would be amenable to the work of operation research, and they shouldn't all be done. It should be done by people who live there, indigenous people.
Absolutely.
rather than bringing people in
Yeah.
from countries that are not familiar with what's happening. I guess the same must be the case in South America as well.
Could be, yeah. I mean, they have so limited resources that it's only natural to think about optimizing and looking for forecasting and stuff like that, because they really need help. And I mean, let's hope in the near future the things evolve and develop there.
Yeah, it would be nice to see that before I finally give up on OR,
right.
if ever I do.
In recent years, you became the editor of the Impact magazine from the British Rho Society. What are the aims and the purpose of this magazine?
So, yes, I was approached to be the editor. It's a new magazine, and the aim was to actually spread the word about operation research. So it was not to be directed at operation researchers, but it was to be directed at potential decision makers who might use operation research. Quite why they asked me to do it, I don't particularly know, but they obviously thought that I would pick up on that because of my interest in practical operation research. So it's been going now for 7 years, comes out twice a year, and it mostly consists of stories about successful operation research. There are one or two other styles of articles, but that's the bulk of the articles. So nearly all the articles I solicit. A few people have written to me and said, I've done this work, would it be of interest to the magazine? But mostly I attend conferences, or I hear about work that's being done, or read there's some work published in a journal, in a scientific journal with all the maths. And I asked people if they could tell the story without any of the mathematics about what their problem was, how they went about solving it, and most importantly, what was the outcome, what were the results. And I look for ideally look for a quotation from a client, satisfied client that says, this is the difference this work has made to our operations, or whatever it might happen to be. So I've enjoyed doing it. When I started, I said I'd do 4 issues, and this week, or maybe next week now, the 14th issue is going to be published. So it's would have been going 7 years. They haven't found a replacement for me, but
right.
So yes, it certainly extended my involvement in OR. It's enabled me to go to various conferences that I probably wouldn't have gone to, which I enjoy in meeting people, but it's also enabled me to promote operation research. The magazine itself goes to all members of the Operation Research Society, but it's not written for them. But they enjoy reading it because there's no equations.
Yeah. I can totally understand that. You have done a lot for the OR community across 5 decades. And I'm talking, the worldwide community.
Yes.
If you were to pick your main contributions, what would they be?
Well, in different ways, I've tried to promote OR as much as I have to do OR. So my work in Africa was to encourage other people in Africa to do operation research, or to create societies to come together, to work together. So I was looking to be a facilitator, if you like, so to enable other people to have opportunities. My involvement in conferences and organising them, and when I've been organising them, is to try and encourage some different things to happen and give different types of experiences at these conferences. So I've tried to, I hope, I certainly tried, and I hope I've succeeded in actually enriching, in a little way, the field of operation research. It's obviously been dominated my professional career completely. And it's been very satisfying. Mm-hmm. And I hope that some of the things that I've done have made a difference.
Yeah, it certainly did. Of course.
Some of them will have done, but not necessarily everything. But
Yeah, some people they tend to just look at their, how many publications you have, and all the methodological contributions a particular author has. But I feel that there is another type of contribution, as you said, like promoting OR and encouraging students, and sometimes they may be overlooked. Do you agree with that?
well, they may be overlooked, but an academic career is ultimately satisfying because you've affected the lives of your students, haven't you? I think. Yes, publications are important. Obviously, these days are absolutely crucial for promotions and so on. But I find it very satisfying when I meet former students and they remember something I said and said it made a difference to them. And that's what satisfies me most, I suppose, that the fact that there have been some people, at least, who've had the positive experience of having met me.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your experience as president of the Omega Rho Society.
Oh, well, this, yes, I had to learn to say Omega Rho because this is an American society. I would say Omega Rho. This is the International Honor Society for Operations Research. It's very closely linked with IFORS, but it's separate to it. But each conference there is an Omega Rho distinguished lecture. But they were keen to have a European director. So Saul Gass, who is again a very prominent member of the IFORS community and indeed the Omega Rho community, a good friend, he asked me if I'd become the European director, and unless you said you didn't want to do it any longer, once you were in the committee, you just carried on being in the committee, and I quite enjoyed it. I mean, it didn't. At each IFORS meeting annually we'd have our committee meeting. So I was involved for a number of years, and of course by that time everybody else had been the president on the committee, so it was my turn. So very surprising, because we've got no history of honour societies in the United Kingdom. I became the first non-American to be the president of Omega Rho. And I'm still involved. I was on a conference call a week ago with the committee for this year, and still trying to help them a bit. So yes, that was very interesting, and it meant that I chaired several plenary sessions at IFORS conferences in my own particular way.
Uh-huh. In 1980, you published a paper entitled "Teaching Operational Research to First-Year Undergraduates: Experience at Lancaster." That appeared in the 5th volume of JORS. And in such paper, you expressed the following concern, and I quote, "The teaching of OR at undergraduate level has recently come under heavy fire." For example, in a letter to the editor of the OR newsletter, someone suggested that it's futile to attempt to teach OR to undergraduates. OR was and should be multidisciplinary and learned through practice. Only postgraduates and preferably post-experienced students are in any position to appreciate OR. What is your opinion on this matter in nowadays context?
Well, I suspect then, as now, there's a certain amount of truth there. When I went to Lancaster, we were starting a first-year course. So our undergraduate degree, at that time, students came to Lancaster. They did 3 different subjects, one of which was their intended major subject, but they would pick up a sort of a subsidiary subject, but also something they could choose right across the university. This was quite unusual in the UK. But they were just starting the first-year course, and I was asked to work on that with the head of department. And yes, I mean, I've already expressed that the motivation of our operation research department in Lancaster was a very practically oriented one. And the criticism that was being made was that how can 18-year-olds coming out of school have any experience that's relevant to doing operation research from a practical perspective? Yes, you can teach them in the programming, you can teach them queuing theory, you can do. So what we did was actually to create what sort of case studies. We didn't call them case studies, but they were extended problems, and we would we present them with the problem scenario and some data, and they would have to work out what to do. So it might be a production scheduling problem, and we would give them various bits of data and so on, and they would have to work out what the best schedule was, or whatever it happened to be. And my head of department, I was working with, he was extremely good at writing these case studies. So we tried to give them a flavour of actually working on operation research problems. And then we would extend that into their second and third years. And over the years, I was very involved with the courses that would teach, we used to call them consultancy skills or problem solving skills or whatever. And we would teach, how do you go about doing a problem? And we would do it by the mechanism of a problem. And for many years, I would teach the course that gave them a problem, which they would tackle in groups over the course of 10 weeks, and then make a presentation at the end and would mark them on the analysis that they'd done, but also on the way they presented their work and so on, to get the mark for that particular module. So we tried to simulate, if you like, the experience of doing a project in operation research. And then, as I've already said, the master's students, that carries on with the emphasis on a third of the course being tackling a real problem in that case. But yes, it is difficult to get across the full flavour of what an operation research project is. But my colleagues over the years, they've encouraged them to look for problems on the campus, queuing for service in one of the campus shops or whatever, how many counters should there be in the campus banks or whatever. So they would go and collect data, and they would work out their own
there are many problems that you can find in universities, for example.
You can find them everywhere,
problem, course timetabling problem, things like that. Yeah.
So that was certainly the major focus of the department. Yeah.
Right.
But yes, I didn't expect things that I'd written 40 years ago to be quoted back at me. So I hope that you haven't got too many more of those that say, what do I think of that now? Yes. And I hope you haven't found too many errors in the paper.
No, come on. No, I found that really interesting. That's why I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, sure.
My research team is actually composed of mostly undergraduate students. And I encourage them to study OR and, being involved in projects right from the beginning. So they might be 18-year-old students, 19-year-old students. And I noticed that the sooner they start learning about OR, of course, in my team, we have an emphasis on combinatorial optimization. But when they start coding, branch and cut algorithms, column generation, and advanced heuristics, things like that, they can quickly contribute with ideas, and some of them become really addicted, and that's what I actually expect. And one of the key factors is the fact that they start studying at a very young age. So if I did not push them and encourage them to study right from the beginning, we'll probably be in a very unfavorable position, because it takes time until you have the capacity to contribute to the field. It takes a couple of years at least to get familiar with the tools, the theory, the implementation details, and things that are not even clear in books or even in papers. So you need guidance. They need guidance and things like that. That's why when I read this part, I was, I would not say shocked, but really surprised with such a strong statement that was made back then.
Yeah.
Do you have any special message or advice for youngsters in the field of OR?
Well, keep in OR and keep. I mean, obviously, my life in OR has been more characterized perhaps by service than research, but that's not to say that I don't think that research is important. But I think it's unfortunate that if you want to get promoted, it's the be-all and end-all these days. So I was very fortunate to come into this, and it's enriched my life tremendously. They probably won't be watching it, but what does frustrate me sometimes is that students studying mathematics don't consider going into the field of OR because, well, there are obviously other interesting areas of applied mathematics, but if you thought of OR as simply that, as applying your mathematical ability to help people with their problems, then operation research is a very rich field to go into, and it's frustrating that not more very capable mathematicians, and not only mathematicians, but particularly mathematicians, could go into the OR field, but they tend not to these days. In the UK, I mean, it probably is the same in other countries, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Graham, it was fantastic to have this conversation with you. I just,
That's very kind.
Yeah, it was very entertaining to hear so many stories from conferences to societies and even some research work. Thank you so much for your time. It has been a great honor.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'll direct the video to my sons so that they can find out what I've been doing
that's fantastic.
These last 40 years.
Yeah, right. So I hope
thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. I hope to see you soon. Maybe I can visit you in the UK, but you can also come to Brazil. I think you've been here once or twice, right?
Yes, I went to a very, what they called a mini conference in Rio, just before the Argentinian conference in 1987.
Wow.
And I've touched down in Sao Paulo before going on to Chile, but that probably doesn't count.
Yeah, I think it's about time for you to come back and pay us a visit.
Yeah.
Well,
I sometimes think my traveling days are done, but maybe they're not.
Come on. Right. So once again, thank you so much and take care, Graham. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.